1315, and things are not going too well for Edward II. His nobles despised him, his court favourite had just been murdered, he suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of the Scottish, and to make matters worse, due to terrible weather, the harvests had just failed. The population of England at this point had been growing steadily over the centuries since the conquest, and agriculture could only provide enough for subsistence plus a little bit extra for lords and kings. When the harvest failed, it wasn't the lords or their retainers who went hungry, it was the peasants. The famine, which brought with it a huge rise in civil disturbance, did eventually subside, but Edward's reign did not get any easier. His reign was punctuated with more conflict with his nobles, further failings in Scotland, and to put the icing on the cake, his wife, Queen Isabella, betrayed him. She did this when she went to Paris in 1325 to negotiate peace between England and France. This latest war came as a result of Gascony being whittled away by the French king, who consistently sided with French lords in minor territorial disputes against Edward. Edward was unhappy with his territory slowly being stripped away, and so, war, which the French won. Again. Isabella and Edward had a poor relationship at this point due to Edward seizing all of her lands because she was French. Whilst in Paris, Isabella met Roger Mortimer, who soon afterwards became her lover. Isabella at this point was clearly plotting against her husband. Edward became increasingly worried of an impending invasion by Mortimer and Isabella, which he had good reason to, since in 1326 it happened. The invasion wasn't particularly bloody though, and Edward was captured by the end of the year. The next year, Edward was forced to abdicate, the first English monarch to do so, on behalf of his son, who was crowned Edward III. Edward II was imprisoned at Berkeley Castle, where he died in mysterious, probably murder-related circumstances. So Edward III's early reign was dominated by Mortimer and Isabella due to him being 15 and not able to rule on his own. In 1328 the King of France died without an heir and Edward was the nearest relative. His relation was through his mother though, so the French considered it invalid, which Edward didn't mind for now. By 1330 Edward was getting pretty sick of Mortimer and Isabella telling him what to do. He had Mortimer arrested and hanged in the same year, and after that he ruled in his own name. So with Edward now in charge, he did the only thing fitting an English king: invade Scotland. Edward did this by helping Edward Balliol, the son of the exiled and now quite dead King John Balliol. Balliol swore fealty in return for the English giving him help retaking the throne. Edward III invaded with a large army and the Scottish leadership fled to France. In the end, Edward's army was unable to decisively defeat the Scots, and their guerrilla tactics cost the English dearly, just like last time. In 1337, the Scots were able to catch their breath due to events on the continent. Philippe VI of France, the first of the royal house of Valois, had ascended the throne in 1328 and was a close ally of the Scottish. Edward III was the Duke of Gascony and thus technically Philippe's vassal, meaning he wasn't supposed to disobey his lord by conquering his lord's Scottish allies. Philippe decided that Edward was not fit to be his vassal anymore and so ordered that Gascony be forfeit. Edward said no and instead made his claim to the throne of France, and in 1340 began to formally style himself as Edward, King of England and France and Lord of Ireland. War would inevitably follow, and this war would later be known as the 100 Years' War. So the merchants, lords and soldiers which travelled to and from mainland Europe during this period soon came into contact with disease, in this case the Black Death, and brought it back to England with them. The first outbreak was in Weymouth, followed by Bristol and soon after London. The rest of the south was infected not long afterwards, and by the end of 1349 all of England bore the plague and its devastating effects. Scotland, seeing the plague as God punishing the English, started to raid the north, pillaging the already desolated villages. This caused places like Durham significant hardship, but importantly it brought the plague back to Scotland. The plague returned many times over the period, the most notable outbreaks being in 1360, 1369 and 1375. Overall, the death toll of the plague is debated heavily, but general estimates range from 30 to 45% of the population dying, reducing the country from a population of roughly 4 million to 2.5 million. The plague had major effects on the order of society. Since there were no longer enough peasants to work the land, the lords had to begin negotiating with them, and living standards for surviving peasants began to rise in the latter half of the 14th century. Edward and his lords attempted to regulate wages and tried to force the peasantry to fulfil their duties, but ultimately they failed. So Edward III died in 1377 and was succeeded by his grandson Richard II. Richard was only 10 at the time, and so normally a regent would be appointed. In this case, the regency would have gone to John of Gaunt, Richard's uncle. However, John was a very ambitious man and the other nobles were worried he would usurp the throne, so instead a council of advisors was established to govern in Richard's name. So there were two major social problems that the newly crowned Richard had to deal with. The first was the writings of a man called John Wycliffe, who wrote religious polemics on how the English church was too rich and that the bishops shouldn't be allowed to hold positions of power in government. Wycliffe and his followers also broke sacred rules by translating the New Testament into English and criticised the Pope and the clergy heavily. He had powerful backers though, such as John of Gaunt, who liked the idea of the church not having property because that meant more for the nobles. The movement which Wycliffe had founded is known as Lollarding and continued to gain popularity in the following decades. Richard's second issue was that his council of advisors introduced heavy taxes to fund the war, and this upset the peasantry. By 1380, this council was so hated by everyone that the king abolished it. In 1381, the peasantry began to resist paying taxes, violently, in what is known as the Peasants' Revolt. These peasants, led by a man called Wat Tyler, marched on London where they met the king, who chose to compromise. Most notably, Richard promised to abolish serfdom, which the peasants didn't believe, because it was a lie. So serfdom was an extremely complicated economic and social system of mutual rights and responsibilities between a lord and a peasant. In return for land, a home and access to justice, a lord's peasant, the serf, owed their lord a tax which was to be paid with the food they grew with their labour. There were many types of serf, sometimes categorised into free and unfree, but be aware, unfree serfs were not slaves. Incidentally, whilst the negotiations with the king were ongoing, some other peasants murdered the Archbishop of Canterbury. A couple of days later, the king met Tyler again, a scuffle broke out and Tyler was killed. The revolt spread up and down the country, but by November, due to the help of Henry le Despencer, the Bishop of Norwich, the revolt was crushed. The war in France at this point was not going well, and Richard favoured peace, whereas John of Gaunt favoured continuing the war. The two fell out and Gaunt left to pursue his claim to the throne of Castile. The king had appointed two men into high positions, Michael de la Pole, who was Chancellor, and Robert de Vere, who was given numerous important regional positions. In 1386, a parliament, later known as the Wonderful Parliament, was called, and de la Pole asked for more money and taxes. Parliament said no, and that furthermore de la Pole had to go. The king said no, and Parliament responded by essentially saying that either he goes or you do. In the end, de la Pole was removed, becoming the first official ever to have been impeached by Parliament. Richard was not happy with this, and so put de Vere in charge of building a base for royal support in case of civil war. The lords who stood in opposition to the king are known as the Lords Appellant. The most notable were Robert Fitzalan, the Earl of Arundel, and Henry Bolingbroke, the Earl of Derby. Richard, under pressure from these lords, conveyed a parliament called the Merciless Parliament, which condemned the king's closest allies such as de Vere and de la Pole to death. In 1389, John of Gaunt returned and made up with the king. Shortly after this, a truce was signed with France, and in 1394 Richard invaded Ireland, increasing the lands under English control from this to this. In the same year, Richard's wife, Queen Anne, died without the two having produced an heir. Without a son, the person who was next in line to the throne was John of Gaunt, who Richard now saw as an enemy. By 1397, Richard's position was looking weak, and so after waiting for many years, he struck against the lords who had humiliated him. This purge, often called Richard's tyranny, saw Richard's men round up and execute the leading lords appellant, excluding Henry Bolingbroke. Henry had patched things up with the king, but he was soon afterwards exiled. The only real threat to Richard at this point was John of Gaunt. Gaunt died in 1399 though, and thus his son, Henry, would inherit his lands, which would make him the second most powerful man in the kingdom. Henry also importantly inherited Gaunt's claim to the throne, and Richard did not like this one bit. Richard chose to seize all of the exiled Henry's inheritance to make sure that this didn't happen. This may seem like a good idea, but arbitrarily taking your lord's lands and titles away concerned the other lords. If Richard could do it to one lord, he could do it to any. Soon after this, Henry returned to England, and the other lords, now very worried about a tyrannical Richard, flocked to his side. In the end, Richard surrendered, and Henry, amongst others, put forward his claim to be king. Richard was imprisoned, Parliament declared him deposed, and Henry Bolingbroke was crowned King Henry IV, the first king of the House of Lancaster. The Plantagenet dynasty was now over, and importantly, this greatly weakened the monarchy. As Henry had demonstrated, anyone with a claim to the throne, enough noble support, and a large enough army could be made king, and this had huge implications for the following century. Richard still being alive caused problems because some nobles were still loyal to him. These lords attempted to assassinate Henry in what is known as the Epiphany Rising, but they failed, tried to rebel, failed again, but were successful at being beheaded. Soon after this, Richard died, and it is quite likely that Henry IV ordered Richard be allowed to die of thirst in his cell. The Epiphany Rising wouldn't be Henry's last rebellion. In 1400, the Glyndŵr uprising broke out, in which a man called Owain Glyndŵr rebelled against English rule and was proclaimed the Prince of Wales. Glyndŵr pried Wales away from England's grasp for 15 years. Throughout his reign, Henry had issues with raising money from his parliament. At first, he was granted the money he wanted, but when these vast sums of revenue didn't turn into the victories in war that Henry had promised, Parliament accused him of poor governance. Henry did, however, manage to root out Lollardy by authorising the burning of heretics, which did enough to dissuade people from heresy. Henry also was the first English king since 1066 to have his mother tongue be English, and he encouraged his nobles to speak and write in it. His later reign wasn't much better. Henry was plagued by ill health and withdrew from governing the realm, and thus factions developed. The main disagreement was about how to pursue the war with France, which was itself undergoing a civil war. Thomas Arundel, the Archbishop of Canterbury, led one of these factions and was dominant between 1408 and 1411. Henry's health deteriorated and he died in 1413, and his son succeeded him as Henry V, one of the most notable warrior kings in English history. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching. There are some books in the description if you'd like to learn more.